Hello and welcome to video 5 in this series. What I'm going to do today is add some code to allow our button to operate as a sensor. So it's going to get a little bit codey, but you'll learn how to actually modify the platform here. So let's get stuck straight into that. I've got a second Raspberry Pi running that I'm going to be using for testing, as I've got the other one bolted to the front fence. So let's firstly get things set up. If you are doing this, what you would do is go to the GitHub site here and do these installations here that is showing here, the prerequisites that are required for things like voice and things like that. So let's, I've already got those, I'm assuming I've already got those done because I actually have a previous version of the code installed on my Raspberry Pi. So let's go ahead and get this latest code here. So I want this URL here, so I'm going to copy that link address. And I have a PuTTY session here on my Raspberry Pi, so we're now going to type in wget and that particular URL. Okay, and that's now downloaded, so let's take a look for the file name. So let's unzip master.zip. And you can see it's putting that into a folder called Robot AI version 4. So let's rename. As you can see there, it took me a few goes to get the correct Linux command, so I type in move the initial name to the new name, and there we go. So now I can start to edit the files and test running the Robot AI version 4 platform on my Raspberry Pi. Okay, so before we proceed, I just want to make sure the code's running on the Pi now that I've put it on here. But before I do that, I'm going to come in here to the settings, and because we don't actually have a Raspberry Pi camera hooked up to this test Pi here, I'm going to turn off the motion sensor. We already had our voice sensor set to false. I'm going to put in an entry here because we will need this once we start to modify the code for my button sensor. And let's set that one to true so that we're actually listening for the press of a button. And we're done there. So that sets us up so we're ready to actually start putting in some code for our button sensor. Let's just test things are working. And there we go, it's connected to our message queue. You can see that it's not ticking over with messages as it would when we had the motion sensor, but that's because we're not picking up successive frames and analyzing them, so that's all good. So here we are in our Robot AI client. To add some code for an additional sensor, what I simply need to do is come down here to where we're actually kicking off the sensors, and I'll just add some code so it speaks a message perhaps when the button is pressed or plays a sound. That's functionality that's already encapsulated in the voice library, and you can see the voice library of functions is being passed in here when I actually run the voice sensor. So let's actually just take this code here and copy it, paste it down here. So this is going to be for our button sensor, and we created something in our config file called button sensor, so we look at whether that value is true, and I just need to change these details here. Okay, so from the lib folder, import client button sensor, so that's a file we're going to need to create. And we then spawn a new process, and we'll be looking at client button sensor do sensor. So I need to ensure that there is a function in there called do sensor, and if I take the voice sensor file as a starting point, that'll ensure I've got all the right structure and inputs and that sort of thing. And here I need to say failed to start button sensor if we have an error. So that's all I need to do to this particular file. Let's now edit or create a copy of our voice sensor, and we'll sort of strip all of the code out from there and start to set up our code for the button sensor. So here is a copy of the voice sensor file, which I've called button sensor. I've just edited the comments here, and I can now take out what's not going to be required, so I don't think I will need any of those. I'm going to eventually need the Pika library because that's how we can communicate with the message queue. We're not working with Snowboy or anything here, so we can get rid of those. Let's take a look. So when we initialize this object, we'll want to set so we don't need anything about hot word here or sensitivity. We will need to set self.environs so we can access the environ variables. Top dir is probably going to be useful, our top level directory. These items we won't need. We'll need debugging, don't need that there. And that will be useful for connecting to the message queue later on. So we've quickly modified that. These are all specific to our hot word detector, so we can get rid of all these. Okay, so we come down to here. So here we have our function called by when the sensor, the do sensor as we mentioned before. So we need a function here called listen loop. So there's our class we define, and then it's calling in that class a function called passive listen. So let's actually just call it button listen, and we will set up this information here later. I know we can leave that for the moment. That just now enables me to run this in isolation. Actually, I might just get rid of that for the moment. Let's keep things nice and clean. Okay, so let's set up our function for the button listen. Okay, so this is a file that I used when I was doing some basic button testing just by itself, outside of the framework of the AI. All I was doing here was monitoring any press on pin number 12, which is what I've got it connected up to, because that's what I'm going to need to use with the 2 mics pi hat. And I was just using the OS library here to play a beep whenever there was a press of the button. So I can take this code. I'm not going to use the OS, so let's get rid of that. I will need these particular imports here and these particular statements here. So let's put those into our button sensor up the top here. And then our while true, I'll need this particular item here. So we set it up as we're listening on that particular pin. And then this section is what's going to go into our basic button detection loop down here on button listen, like so. Something went a little bit screwy with the indentation there. There we go. And instead of os.system.play, we will use the voice. So I'll need a reference to my voice across all functions here. So let's also set this to be self.voice is voice. This lets me reference the voice library across all functions in my class. And then here we'll leave the basic print function in there. Voice.say, I think, is the particular function. You press the button. Okay, so there's a function in the voice library which lets me say something through the text-to-speech capabilities. So I'm just feeding in a bit of text there when someone's pressed the button. So that should be all we need to do a basic test of our button within this framework here. Further on, I'll work out exactly what I want to do when the button is pressed. Okay, so let's give this a try. And we have an error there, which is telling me on button listen takes 0 positional arguments, but one was given. I think I know what I've done wrong there. So if we come back to our code here, I have not passed in the self. I've not sort of passed the class into the functions here, which means self.voice is meaningless in that scenario. So let's give that another try. So there we go, there's the print message coming through as it's checking for the status of the button, and when I press it,
you press the button.
And back into listening again.
You press the button.
Excellent, so that seems to be working very well. So there you go, within 10 minutes I've shown you how to basically install the software and create a brand new sensor, in this case to listen via a button, granted it's very basic code. But I'm going to end the video there, and then I'll work on some more complex functionality around that, and I'll demonstrate that in the next video. So thank you very much for watching. If you want to be notified of when the next video is out, please subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.